Hi, I'm Charles Evans, music director of the Long Bay Symphony. In this 250th anniversary year of the birth of the great composer Ludwig van Beethoven, it's ironic that the symbolic clarity of the year 2020 is blurred by the tragedy of this COVID virus. As far as Beethoven celebrations for his anniversary, those ensembles that didn't get a chance to do their Beethoven in the first 2.5 months of this calendar year find themselves unable to do any performances through the remainder of the year of any kind of scale. So with that in mind, we at the Long Bay Symphony decided this would be a wonderful way to kick off our new series, Speaking of the Arts, Conversations with Artists, and talk about Beethoven, and specifically that burning question that's been out there for a long time: what makes Beethoven great? And to join me in this discussion is a friend and colleague. This is Tim Koch, who is the music director of the Carolina Master Chorale, as well as being professor of choral activities at Coastal Carolina University. And you still teach voice as well?
I do. I teach voice at Coastal, indeed.
Great.
And I'm also director of the Chancel Choir at First Presbyterian Church.
Yeah, wear many hats.
Yep.
That's great.
Just enough.
Yeah, well,
Not
maybe sometimes too much,
many.
but you can't control
During
that.
COVID, they're a little heavier.
Yeah. But at any rate, when we talk about Beethoven, he's unquestionably in that pantheon of the greatest composers of all time, right there with Bach and
Mozart,
Stravinsky, that handful. But he somehow has been able to even transcend that into this everyman composer who's beloved all over the world, and by people who really have maybe not as much orientation in classical music at all, but rather they're inspired by it. And I think I want to pick up on what you and I were talking about a while back when we got together. The idea, like, what is it? And maybe you talk about your. He's a gateway composer, we'll call it.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I would say my actual conversion to classical music, came through Beethoven. Both my parents are classical musicians, but I, in my childhood and youth, sort of wanted to be anything but that.
Oh yeah, I know that feeling.
And after I, majored in fraternity for 1 year as an undergraduate, then I decided to just try this music thing and see what happened. But I still, I had my popular music that I was, kind of devoted to, and I'd go to class, but I wouldn't say I had a great passion for it. It just seemed like the thing that I had the skill set for because I'd been raised that way. And I vividly recall sitting in a music history class where our professor wanted to convince us that this thing we call the Romantic period, which is more or less the 19th century in music, was that a seminal work that could mark the beginning of that period might be the Beethoven Third Symphony, the Eroica Symphony. And I remember looking at a big screen, and he'd put together some wonderful slides that showed the score, and we listened. And I remember something dawning on me, thinking like that, wow, I had underestimated, the genius of what this is all about. I'd never allowed it to really seep in. It had always been, something superficial. Maybe you studied the classical music, or so for me, it's just, a little bit late. I might have been 19, 20 years old before I really decided, oh my gosh, now I really get it.
Yeah.
And it came to me, almost immediately. And I was so amazed, particularly at the scope of the music, the form of the music, the energy of the music.
Yeah, that above all.
The structure, all of that. That I couldn't believe how complicated it was. From an architectural point of view. Yet how beautifully it worked, just as sheer music, if you don't know anything about the architecture.
Yeah, well, I do think that it's a synthesis of everything, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. I had a similar experience, and my father was a classical musician, or church musician, and as soon as he saw interest in me, he began to feed me things. I'm sure you experienced that same thing, Of course, the one thing that I really rebelled against was the organ. I think you did that.
I did. Yeah, I was a poor organ student. I got it.
But when your father does something, you want to do anything but, or if it's related, you want to do a different. You want to carve out your own.
Neither of my parents could sing, so that's the
there you go. That's good. But when I think I was 12 or so, my dad bought me a little pocket thing of Beethoven symphonies. games, the scores.
Wow.
And then when he gave it to me, it's like, Dad, what are you doing? What am I going to do with this? Within weeks, I was captivated.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And the thing that really, the piece that really got me, strangely enough, were like just the first two movements of Beethoven Ninth.
Yeah.
Because there was just this power, it's like Bruckner has these motto, thematic ideas, and it's just, especially that scherzo, that second movement, just
right.
unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
And I'll have to say, even my brother, who's not musical at all, I mean, he never really studied anything. I think it was like when I went off to college, he got hooked on a Beethoven symphony, and I believe it was the sixth, and nothing would do. But he had to go out and buy the entire set. I think it was Bernard Haitink.
Mm-hmm.
And he bought the entire set, and that's all he would listen to for a while. Then he finally got hooked into the seventh,
mm-hmm.
which, as we talked about, is a pretty significant work.
I love seventh.
And it's just, it's so interesting how people who otherwise aren't turned toward it, classical music, I mean, can't really relate to it, can relate to Beethoven, and that's kind of the mystery. And it's funny, of course, people have talked about what makes Beethoven great since Beethoven was around. And one of the biggest proponents of, kind of discussing these types of things was the great Leonard Bernstein, the conductor and composer. And of course, that was right when TV was coming into its own. He did the omnibus lectures. I believe that was with the Symphony of the Air,
mm-hmm.
The old Toscanini Symphony. Lots of visuals, very interesting what they did for the time. Of course, his young people's concerts, which are now on DVD, or you could get them, you could access them many ways. And he, found ways to discuss very important topics about what makes music tick in general. But he did talk a lot about Beethoven. And so a lot of people have used his example of saying, well, and it's a worthwhile argument, saying well, Beethoven wasn't necessarily great at any one thing. And it's worth saying, because you've probably had this experience too, when I'm in a music appreciation class or I'm doing a lecture to the audience before, I say, okay, name a great Beethoven melody.
Right.
And what's the one that's
well, Ode to Joy.
Ode to Joy.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it's one of the most universal, it's probably the most universally recognized.
But it's such a simple melody.
That's the thing, it's so simple.
Yeah.
But I mean, what would another one be that?
Well, I mean, after that, I mean, maybe like the Moonlight Sonata,
Yeah, maybe. But I think people, at least in my experience, tend to go, oh, Beethoven Fifth.
Oh, Beethoven.
And then again,
but it's not a melody.
Yeah, it's not a melody. That's the thing about it. And so what else is there? I mean, and I remember now, it's Karl Haas.
Oh, yeah, Karl Haas.
Adventures in Good Music. Yeah.
Oh,
and that's the second movement, the slow movement of the Pathétique Sonata.
Pathétique, yeah.
And that, it's, Beethoven either tends to be super energetic or sort of sublime in a way that's, I don't know, I kind of consider it aloof. It's just awesome.
Yeah, right.
But if you contrast that, for example, and those of you listening to this and watching, I mean, with a Tchaikovsky melody.
Yeah.
I mean, Tchaikovsky, for all his flaws, was all about melody.
Right.
And so you think of those great Romeo and Juliet melodies.
Yeah.
You think of any of the concertos or symphonies.
Yeah.
Like the piano concerto opening movement, the love theme from Romeo and Juliet. Then you can even go on to composers like, opera composers. I mean, there's no way you're going to hear a Rossini opera or even an overture and not walk out of the hall humming one of those tunes.
Puccini,
Yeah, and so it's very different. And all the parameters that Bernstein describes, also the sense of harmony. I mean, I don't know that Bernstein tend to, to make his point, belittle everything, but Beethoven was operating within that classical style. So harmony served a certain purpose. And it's not as though he was a bad harmonist,
right?
But he didn't really necessarily break out into any brand new territory because that aesthetic didn't allow for it in the same way that the Romantics utilized, tonal shifts, although he did do that, obviously.
Right. Mm-hmm. And particularly in the late work.
Yeah. But you look at then Berlioz, who's, the great Symphonie Fantastique was written 3 years after Beethoven died. And I mean, it's got really adventurous stuff in it.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, that's, he doesn't stand out, let's say, in terms of pure harmony, nor in orchestration necessarily. People have complained, we'll get to that hopefully if we have time, but I mean, if you think of a perfect composer, I'll go ahead and ask that question. I mentioned it to you. Like, who to you, in terms of practicality, is a perfect composer? Like you just pick it up and it works.
Yeah, and it works. Well, I mean, I think I'm not
In other
sure.
words, you don't have to make adjustments just to make the piece work.
Yeah, I mean, I find Mozart that way. I don't know if you do or not. I mean, I just find Mozart being a real, economy of notes.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that part of the trouble with that is that because of that economy, orchestrally speaking, it's actually
dangerous.
A lot
it's
harder.
Dangerous, right?
Every phrase has to be right. But when and just thinking of, say, vibrancy of orchestration from my standpoint, when you look at, say, Rimsky-Korsakov,
I see.
you may love it, you may not like it that much. Sometimes it's a little bit pedestrian.
Yeah.
But you sit down, play it. What's that?
Tchaikovsky 4.
Yeah, sure. And then Ravel. I mean, to me, he's the best. Mm-hmm. Everything he writes, every little detail works exactly. So it looks incredibly complicated, but he knows what he's doing, and it just falls right into place. Right. But with regard to Beethoven, there are definitely adjustments. I think part of it was him being deaf.
Absolutely.
And there are lots of times where, for example, he puts the melody in the bottom end. You can't hear it at all. He's living in his own world with that kind of thing.
And it's particularly difficult for the singers because he treats the singers like instruments.
Right, and all those high sustained notes are just crazy.
So you're constantly moving people around up to other parts of things.
Yeah, but there are other issues like counterpoint and so on, which we really don't need to necessarily go into. And Beethoven was in an era of the classical style, which they didn't write fugues. They were more interested in the structure that they were dealing with. And, maybe there were fugato elements throughout in pieces, but not strictly a fugue.
Yeah.
So
I had a teacher who would say that, in each new period, counterpoint was sort of the thing that came along last.
It would always catch up, like the late stuff, like the Rosa Fuga.
Right, and so I mean, he wrote an incredible fugue there. With actually certain harmonic things that we didn't even really see.
Right, by that time it was it was all inside his head.
Right, I mean, it sounded almost like something a direct line to Schoenberg.
Yeah. But I think if you take all those elements, you pour it into the thing you already talked about, the structure. That's the thing that makes this whole thing tick. You just take these ordinary ingredients and put them into a mold and say dealing with time.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah.
But then we had also talked recently about the fact that, if you just do that, then why isn't Haydn as exciting?
Right.
Because I love doing Haydn symphonies. And if you think about the complexity of how Haydn manipulated his theme, bits of the melody, in that finale. It's unbelievable. He fragments it down to 2 notes. It's really just a tour de force. But when you play the piece, it just sounds nice.
Right. Yeah.
So what's the difference?
It's cerebral and less dramatic. I mean, there's all that muscle, in Beethoven's works.
And I think that's the difference. It's the muscle.
People are moved by that. Yeah.
Right. And it's the muscle that's injected into the structure.
Yeah.
That makes it all come together.
You think of, the beginning of the choral, in the ninth, nothing like that, previous to that.
Yeah, and of course the history was, he blew everybody away when he first went to Vienna, and he was performing and improvising, and they just had never heard anyone play so aggressively and with such, just strange, really. Accents and just levels of intensity. And I think that's the thing. It's not only the intensity, because let's say arguably, we talked about this because when I was doing my comps at Eastman, there's a very prominent theorist there with whom I didn't necessarily agree in my comps, because I basically said, why is Stravinsky beloved and not Schoenberg? And it's like, well, that's because there's some rhythm. There's something there for people to latch on to.
Right.
And, it's just the idea that you're riding this train of energy. And so that sort of supersedes other things. And I really think that that's the kind of thing that creates the energy that's accessible to people. It's a rhythmic base, but it's also with such emotional intensity. But, like I was referring to in the Surprise Symphony of Haydn, I mean, there's a lot of motivic development there. It's really astounding what he does. And he's certainly not upstaged by Beethoven in that regard.
Right.
But what Beethoven is able to do with four notes in the opening of the Fifth Symphony, I mean, the whole piece, the whole movement is about that one thing, and with such riveting intensity that.
And the scherzo too. I mean,
yeah.
the same, you know,
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah. So it's amazing. But I think a lot of it too is the Beethoven mystique. You know, it's one of those things at the right place at the right time. And I think that in every great success, if you look in history, I mean, even look, I saw Bill Gates on TV a few minutes ago, and I mean, he was doing the right thing just at that time where that mattered.
Yeah.
And I think for Beethoven, I think for Beethoven it was the same thing, because he came from musicians who were tradespeople, you know. So his grandfather was with the Elector of Cologne in Bonn, and then, you know, his father, who was not as successful as many folks know, and sort of abused Beethoven. But the idea is, just like Mozart, who was also that way, Beethoven came from a trade family, a certain caste, if you will. People just did what their families did. And Beethoven broke that mold. And if you look ahead to what he inspired in the Romantic period, with Schumann, his father just being a middle-class bookseller, with Schubert coming from a long line of teachers and so on. This was a completely different thing. But Beethoven sort of seized on that moment where society was changing from, you know, the aristocracy, and you serve them or the church, to a more of an open market of the bourgeois consumer class. And so he seized upon that, maybe not consciously, but certainly by sheer force of who he was and what he dealt with. He became this sort of hero who struggled against all this, you know, just negative elements in his life, most notably his deafness, his feigned feeling that he was of nobility with the fan Beethoven. Now, there was an interesting thing, and he fought for custody of his nephew, and that basically destroyed both him and his nephew, because he had no idea how to rear a child. But he was in the courts. He went to the high court there in Vienna, and they find out, well, give me the derivation of that name. You know, it's not fawn, it's fan. And as I understand it, the case got thrown out for that reason. So, but he was, I think, at that time also very staunch defender of you know, equality and humanity. And of course, I'm sure people know the great story of the Eroica Symphony, that was originally dedicated to Napoleon. But as soon as he found out that Napoleon had declared himself emperor, he violently ripped the title page off and just made it to, you know, as a heroic symphony to a great hero. So I think he stood for many things in that era for people, what with his disabilities that he had to overcome, and that eccentric nature that, you know, had him revered as an artist. Like people, there are all sorts of stories about. I mean, there's one. I guess he was with Goethe, the great, you know, poet, philosopher, and Renaissance man, and at a spa. I think it was Teplitz or something like that, and a train of nobility carriages, you know, passed by, and Goethe very reverently, you know, took off his hat and stood there. Beethoven just kept walking. And he later said, you know, my nobility is here and here. And I think that's the thing that really stuck, you know, and he was able to market that because he was so eccentric. But my favorite story, just to take a minute, I must have read it, like the Thayer's Life of Beethoven. Somewhere I found it, but I guess one day he was walking the streets of Vienna and trying to get inspired for, you know, he's composing, always stuck in his head, you know, some tune. So he's walking around, but he got curious and started looking at people's windows. And so after a while, it got reported, and so the police came and arrested him. And he said, oh, well, no, I'm Beethoven. And, yeah, right, you're Beethoven. They took him to jail, and they finally, he was finally able to get them to access somebody who knew, said, no, this is really Beethoven. And it's just so funny to kind of get that you know, disparity between the great icon even during his
Right.
lifetime, and
The
then
social misfit.
coming as such an odd character, and just dealing with such struggle. But I think they're just so many things. I think in addition to that is the notion of, whereas Mozart, for example, just tossed off works. He's known to have written, I guess, what was it, the Prague Symphony, while he was in a carriage going
Right.
there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And of course, everything was in his head.
And there were never erasers, and he'd write down the first violin part first, rather he would write horizontally where everybody else would write vertically.
And then here's Beethoven struggling for 5-8 years
Right.
on a theme like the famous first movement of the Fifth Symphony theme. It had to gestate. And so I think that was this sense of, developing stuff, and also writing for your own inner need.
Mm-hmm.
The idea, like, for example, Haydn writing 104 symphonies, and Mozart, 31, probably more, and then Beethoven just 9. And that's such an interesting cutoff, too, because how many others?
Yeah, Bruckner, Mahler.
It's
Schubert,
interesting how that seemed like he cast such a specter over the.
Some people never wanted to write a 10th because they thought they might die.
Yeah. So it's interesting. But do you have any other anecdotes that you know about Beethoven?
Well, I visited his home in Vienna. And of course, there are all these,
one of many.
Yeah, and an interesting thing was how many composers wanted to serve as pallbearers, at his funeral. I mean, he was so beloved by the next generation of composers. Yeah. Of course, he's well known for destroying pianos.
And they had to get him toward the end of his life. Much before that, I would imagine. He had to order, I think they finally got it, was it a Brentwood or something from England,
right,
that was heavy enough that he wouldn't break the strings all the time.
And then anecdotes about him conducting his own music, and having to be turned around at the end of the concert
to see the audience
that kind of thing, because he lost his hearing.
Yeah. I think one of the things I also wanted to bring up, which is particularly fascinating to me, is his preoccupation with the metronome.
Yeah.
And this character Melzel was able to develop a tick-tock device that could regulate the speed.
And it's been very controversial with conductors.
It has been, and that's the thing I want to discuss, because the thing is, he felt he found the real factual means to document what he wanted in his music. But then comes the uncomfortable, awkward part, that here's this guy who's deaf, and I'm sure I've dealt with a lot of composers with who can hear perfectly fine, but once they're playing that tape in their head of what it sounds like, they're just kind of cooking along, let's say with no resistance.
Right.
It's just going. And when you take a tempo that seems right in your head to the physical resistance of singing or playing.
Right.
So I had this image of Beethoven finding this device, going back like he did with so many of his scores, and setting the metronomes, that's the tempo. And then for us to realize later, try it at that it's absolutely unplayable.
Yeah.
So even there, where he was trying to, really stake it down for all time, is flawed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not only could you say the tempo could be varied according to acoustic circumstances, but this just isn't playable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are lots of things in the symphonies that just aren't playable.
Right. It sure was fun. The 80s, or I think back in the 80s, I recall, is when it really became such a hot topic, and there were all these new conductors like John Elliott Gardner, and who were really trying to find the performance practice, and the calfskin timpani heads, that are so loud, and the tempi and all that. Every time I went to a conducting workshop, we'd have to do a little Beethoven. Usually the recitatives, the cello recitatives, and the and there was always, a lot of the discussion was always around the tempo markings. More than any other composer.
Yeah. Well, now speaking of just pieces, did we talk about what your favorite Beethoven is?
It's it's still kind of hard to answer. I mean, I think of a few, but I mean, I so love the Seventh Symphony, and
Yeah, well, I think that's probably right at the top of many
I mean,
people's lists.
I love the the theme of the slow movement, yeah,
Ooh,
and
yeah.
the arch of
And
it.
it's not really a melody.
Right,
Again,
again.
it's a pulse.
Yeah, and I mean, I love the Ninth Symphony, because
Yeah.
it's I mean, it is what it's 70 minutes long, and so as I understood, the original length of the CD was determined by the CEO of Sony because it fit his favorite German performance of the Ninth Symphony was 74 minutes,
Yeah.
and so that's how the CD got its original length.
Interesting.
So I mean, and I've been involved in. I mean, I don't know how many performances of the Ninth Symphony now.
Yeah.
Preparing the choir, I've been able to conduct it a couple of times myself, and so I mean that sort of stands as like the granddaddy of them all or something.
Yeah, yeah.
But and then I love the piano sonatas. I mean, I love the Pathétique. I love so it's hard for me to. I love the choral fantasy, which is such a strange piece that maybe not everybody knows, but it's a piano concerto with a choir, which is
it's interesting to imagine how he came up on that. And that's not been a piece I've ever done. I've heard it several times.
Yeah, a really interesting piece, and it's reminiscent of the Ninth Symphony, and it's it's choral writing and so forth. So I don't know. I find his choral music difficult to sing. I mean, it's rewarding when the performance is over, but it's rewarding because you were part of an orchestra, and not so much because
and doing a great piece of music. But that's.
But I would rather sing the Brahms Requiem than
right. And I mean, he seemed to have more sensitivity to that sort of thing. Yeah. And I'm just thinking of mine, because we had talked about a lot of this stuff. We even talked a little bit about, bad Beethoven, which, you can't say that. But to me, the whole idea of good Beethoven, the essence of Beethoven, let's say, is that he's taking this structural power and the rhythmic energy and manipulating everything in a very terse way that just keeps you bound up. So the Fifth Symphony first movement is a great example. I mean, you just riveted there. And the funny thing is it's full-blown sonata form, not only with the opening, the development, and the return or recapitulation, but then a big hunking, coda stuck on the end. He could have stopped it 2 minutes or 3 minutes earlier, but he just kept going. All of that's 7 minutes long, and you're just sitting there being riveted by this. And on the other hand, if you think of, and it's not, who am I to say anything is less good of Beethoven's than the other, but we talked about this. I think about being that the terseness of it is so important to me in making his language work. The first movement of that violin concerto, and it's like 23, 24 minutes long. And all the themes are laid out in full. And it's funny, I was thinking about this earlier because of the magic of Beethoven. I thought, it's sort of like being in a Zoom meeting or a lecture, and you're sitting there, or a webinar, and you're sitting there listening to stuff, and then all of a sudden you realize you're starting to repeat, like somebody saying kind of the same thing as somebody else. And first thing you do, and see, with Beethoven Fifth, you never do that.
Right.
But that violin concerto, I find
all
myself,
the great violinists play it.
I know. I mean, and it is a great work. It's just that it doesn't have that element. Now, to me, and we talked about this too, the idea of Beethoven's intensity being, contained in a funny anecdote, which it's true, that whereas Rossini wrote an overture that could easily suffice for 4 different operas, he would just switch them out. In fact, the Barber of Seville overture was some other overture before he just stuck it on there. And so, give him an overture and we'll have fun. Whereas that was the case with Rossini. He could, write one overture and use it many times. Beethoven went through this painstaking process in his one opera to write 4 overtures. And, it's funny because the Leonore number 1, 2, and 3 seem to develop further on each other. To what I consider my absolute favorite Beethoven piece, and that's Leonore number
3. Wow.
Because it's got everything in this 14-minute piece. So you can't not like it. I mean, even if you get bored after 20 minutes of even Beethoven, this thing just keeps you riveted. but I think it dawned on him after trying to improve on his original concept, and then with the final rewriting of the opera and having it re-premiered many years later, I think he realized that brevity was the answer. So after the three Leonores, and didn't he rename the opera for that?
I think so.
And it
yeah.
became Fidelio.
Right.
So the fourth overture for the opera was Fidelio Overture, which is all of 6 minutes long. So, and totally different material, really. So it's just indicative of that super intensity that he was really full of. So let's see, I was going to ask you about, so you've been very gracious about, now, have you, bad Beethoven?
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually would go back to that choral fantasy just because I think it's such a, I mean, I think there's some reason that there aren't, choral piano concertos by other composers. It's a very sort of contrived, I don't recall if it was for a particular, event or something like that, but that piece in particular, when I've listened to it before, it fits a little niche. Let's say, a pianist, who has some familiarity with it. You have only, 15 minutes or whatever it is on your program, it can fit a little niche. But,
well, it's like the Comte Prosperous Voyage thing.
The Comte, right, exactly right.
It's a very strange little piece.
Right, very strange.
And it's not necessarily bad Beethoven. It's just kind of like...
And we haven't talked about, the Missa Solemnis, the choral composers, I think choral conductors, think of that also as, one of our, real tours de force.
Yeah, kind of along the same lines as the Verdi Requiem, just this big epic thing. I'd love the opportunity to do
all
that.
All the double choir and, all of that, which all sort of points back to the, to great Baroque composers, the double choir music and so forth.
Yeah.
We don't think of Beethoven particularly as sacred music composer, but that particular work is
probably in the same way that you think of Brahms as a sacred, because he wasn't particularly doctrinally religious, but very spiritual, and that Requiem is quite a departure.
Very much, with the
but
text,
very effective, very touching. But so let's say, as far as technical things, what has been the hardest Beethoven challenge that you've had?
Well, I mean, again, he treats the voices, like instruments. And so you have to teach the sopranos, how to manage, singing all those high A's in a row. In the B flats, in the soft, singing. That's very difficult. Or how to, project like a trombone when you sing, Zeitung schlungen, in the big double fugue.
Yeah.
So
any particular moment or a spot that's just like, you just think, okay, something has to be done to rewrite it or.
Well, I mean, I wonder about the, the quartet, the vocal quartet,
that is hard, tonally hard.
Yeah. I mean, you bring in four perfectly, respectable professional soloists, and they rehearse together, and it doesn't just snap together ever. It doesn't.
Yeah, it's hard.
And then even in a performance, you're very wary about this
because of the spacing.
Right.
It's very hard tonally.
The intonation is really hard, and the rhythm is it's hard to get it to match up.
Yeah,
the tempo match.
I think the rhythm is the overriding worry and concern in general.
Yeah.
Like even something as subtle as the first movement of Beethoven Sixth. It's just rocking along fine, and then he puts triplets against the, I have the signal that we're close to wrapping it up. But, it's like we referred to classical music. You were talking about, Mozart being playable, but on the other hand, from the orchestral standpoint, I find it's a lot easier to put together what I call a bells and whistles program, with Pines of Rome or something, a Rimsky-Korsakov. It just flows. Mm-hmm. Whereas you've got to make sure everybody's on the same page with regard to, classical stuff, Beethoven included. And just those little subtle rhythmic things, you don't have everyone reading it the same way. Right. But I think the toughest one, just to wrap this up, it's the toughest spot I feel I've encountered in Beethoven or the most vexing, maybe. It's not necessarily tough. It just doesn't seem to work like the quartet in the Ninth Symphony finale, is the rescue scene, the final bit in Leonore Number 3, when you get one violin and they join. It never, ever works.
Oh, yeah.
I've never done it where it's worked just right.
Wow.
And I think there's spots like that that stick in our mind.
Yeah.
And certainly with Beethoven, that's one. I'm sure you got loads, but then they start all playing back at you. And so I was thinking about, and this is off task, but Copland's El Salon Mexico. It's never worked just right. It's just too demanding.
Yeah.
So and I think things like that in Beethoven's music are fairly common, simply because, being deaf as he's writing this, he's in an ideal world. He didn't understand necessarily the physical resistance that was involved in it. So,
right. Yeah.
Anyway, well, this has been fun. Thank you. We're going to wash our hands right after this. Anyway, it's been a pleasure to start this Speaking of the Arts series, and we look forward to seeing you all with us again. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody.